In the last 3 decades, a remarkable change has transformed the face of the world's most populous country. The figures are mind-boggling. Since 1980, China's gross domestic product has increased by over 3,000%, from 300 billion to over 10 trillion. This boom has been fueled by the remarkable rise of China's manufacturing sector, symbolized by the ubiquitous Made in China mark on seemingly every factory-made product. In 1988, China's global trade was valued at 200 billion. Today, it is worth over 4 trillion. This has led to a now familiar narrative. From a primarily poor and agrarian country, China is now increasingly urban, with a burgeoning middle class enabled by the Chinese Communist Party's relaxation of rules on private capital. This, we are told repeatedly, has led to more people being lifted out of poverty than ever before in the history of the world.
China is honoring former leader Deng Xiaoping for engineering the country's rapid economic growth. Chen Wei-xiao is from Deng's home province of Sichuan. He says Deng's economic reforms made life better for ordinary Chinese.
We're eating well and we have nice clothes to wear. It's a well-off society. Everything is good. I'm very happy.
Chen was a tourist in the southern city Shenzhen. The city was China's first special economic zone, which offered preferential treatment for foreign investors and exporters wanting to cash in on the country's cheap labor.
Thing that they've done over the past 3 decades is lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and I think that's a good achievement. In the past 10 years, there's been more attempt to secure the interests of disadvantaged people and of relatively poor people in the countryside.
As compelling as this narrative is, it does not tell the whole story. While no one can deny that the country as a whole is significantly wealthier than it was 3 decades ago, the masses of poor itinerant workers remain largely impoverished, dividing their lives between long hours in sweatshop-like factories and restless nights in squalid, overcrowded company dormitories.
For the time being, China's most significant contribution to the global economy remains cheap, reliable labor. Anyone who's ever worked an assembly line can tell you about the pressure and the boredom and the fatigue.
Conditions in the factories have often been harsh. Poor safety, illegally long working hours, cramped accommodation, few breaks and little leave.
An undercover investigation into the world's largest electronics company, Samsung, by the human rights organization China Labour Watch, has revealed that abuse of workers is rife in factories either owned by Samsung or in those that make parts for Samsung products. 8 factories were investigated, including 6 directly operated by Samsung and 2 supplier plants by spies posing as workers or interviewing workers. They found forced and excessive child labor, excessive overtime, exhausting working conditions, and widespread verbal and physical abuse.
This story, the story of the brutal conditions that make the world's cheap plastic products possible, and the desperation of the workers who make them, has threatened to burst through the bubble of first-world ignorance before. In 2012, the issue of the suicide problem at electronics manufacturer Foxconn, with over 1 million employees across China and 400,000 in Shenzhen alone, became headline news when it was brought to the public's attention by Mike Daisy and his one-man show, The Agony and the Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, which detailed his experience traveling to Shenzhen with an interpreter and interviewing the company's workers.
In my first 2 hours of my first day at that gate, I met workers who were 14. I met workers who were 13 years old. I met workers who were 12. Do you really think Apple doesn't know?
When Daisy's story was eventually found to contain errors and fabrications, the issue of Foxconn's treatment of its workers disappeared from the news cycle. But the reality underlying that story, a reality of long hours and poor pay and suicide nets, disappeared with it.
The suicide nets went up in the spring of 2010 when 9 Foxconn workers jumped to their deaths in the span of 3 months. A total of 18 employees took their own lives or tried to in recent years.
Some striking news. An employee of Foxconn Technology Group attempted to kill himself by cutting his veins Thursday in South China's Shenzhen city. He survived after medical treatment, while the suicide attempt came after 12 Foxconn employees had tried to end their lives, and 10 had succeeded by falling from buildings so far this year.
A tragic state of affairs, and in response, Foxconn has taken action to ensure the mental health of their employees by making them sign a pledge vowing not to kill themselves. Done and done.
While the average worker building electronics in the U.S. today makes over $23 an hour and works 41 hours a week, most of the people at Foxconn earn just over $2 an hour and strive for a 60-hour work week.
Shifts have overtime built in, so workers regularly do more than 60 hours a week, more than Apple's guidelines.
So if the workers at the bottom of China's economic miracle have seen very little of the benefits of that miracle, the question is, who has? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that a small group of families, all related to a small cadre of politicians and bureaucrats surrounding Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping during the country's transition out of Maoism in the 1970s, have reaped the lion's share of this new wealth. And they did so by cutting a deal with the corporate, financial, and banking elite of America, who were searching for a way to move the US manufacturing base offshore. In order to understand this part of the story, we must first understand the history of China to know that this is not the first time the country was colonized to serve wealthy foreign interests. In the 18th century, Europeans developed a taste for various Chinese goods, including silk, tea, and porcelain. The trade for these goods was largely one way. China was not so interested in European goods. As a result, more and more of Europe's silver bullion found its way into China and stayed there. To correct this trade imbalance, the British East India Company hit upon a Machiavellian solution. It used intermediaries in Turkey and India to smuggle opium into China, where opium dens became commonplace and the effects of opium addiction ravaged the Chinese countryside. By 1838, as many as 12 million addicts populated the opium dens, many idle and unemployed, some selling their family into slavery to afford their habit. When Chinese Special Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu was dispatched to Canton, now modern-day Guangzhou, to stop the opium trade, the British responded by sending warships and expeditionary forces to wreak havoc on Chinese ports and coastal cities. This, the First Opium War, led to a decisive British victory in the Treaty of Nanjing, which ceded Hong Kong to the British, as well as forcing open 5 major port cities to British trade, including Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. This began an era that Chinese nationalists later called the Century of Humiliation. The Qing dynasty had itself been humiliated, and unequal treaties like the Treaty of Nanjing undermined traditional Chinese trade restrictions, foreign relations, and even the country's legal system. China had become yet another outpost of the British Empire, still autonomous, but as integral to Britain's trade interests as any of its colonies. With the Communist Revolution of 1949, China once again retreated into its Middle Kingdom status, severing its diplomatic and economic ties to Britain, the United States, and the other Western powers that had long held such power over it. As Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization explains, however, those ties were to be formed once again, less than 3 decades later.
So 1972 is a landmark date. 1976 is the major landmark date for the transition. Zhou Enlai dies in early 76. He was very much a go-between the two factions within the Communist Party, the left and the right, the capitalist roaders and so on. And then Mao Zedong passes in September. And immediately after the death of Mao Zedong, there is a regime change where the so-called Gang of Four, but they were depicted as the Gang of Four, the 4 major leaders of the within the state apparatus, were in effect displaced and arrested and demonized. And in fact, these were supporters of Mao Zedong. This coup could not have taken place while Mao Zedong was still alive. And the Western media celebrated, pretty much reverberated the position of the Communist Party. And then there was a period of transition with with a new leader, Hua Guofen, which lasted approximately, about a year to 2 years. And Deng Xiaoping made his comeback in 77, 78. And in 1978, they established the free trade zones, which was very crucial. And subsequently, of course, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping travels to America and also makes the statement or expresses his anti-Soviet position. And he said, "How do we tame the polar bear?" so to speak. And then in the early 80s, you had some important landmark decisions. One was, I think, 83 was the new Chinese constitution, which abolishes the People's Commune, which ultimately was still how they managed to inscribe economic policies within the constitution is quite unusual in some regards. And then in the following year, in 84, they extend the special economic zones to much broader areas in what were formerly the treaty ports of the colonial or the semi-colonial period. Now that is, of course, very important because what they were restoring, and in the same cities, we're talking about Tianjin, Guangzhou, Shanghai, of course, and what they do is they restore areas where foreign companies can come in and invest. It's much more directed towards broader industrialization, technology. It's not limited simply to assembly line type of operations, but that was, of course, very crucial. Now, I should make a flashback to the 19th century, because in the wake of the Opium Wars, which started in 1839, without getting into the complexities of this war, there was a treaty, and there were subsequent treaties. The Treaty of Nanjing is 1842, which opens up China to Western merchants and investment and so on, including, and then subsequently railways, public infrastructure and so on, and puts China's trade under the control of the colonizers, in particular Britain, and controlled the customs. Now, that particular structure was used as a model to restore the relationship to foreign capital in the wake of let's say, in the wake of Mao's death, what we might describe as the post-Mao era. And they use, in fact, the same terms, the open door policy. Now, the open door policy is an American concept, which was part of a treaty. It's the Treaty of Wanxia, which was signed shortly after the Treaty of Nanjing. And so there they reinstate the structures of trade which prevailed prior to 1949.
The ringleaders of this transition are known in China as the Eight Immortals, Communist Party members who rose to prominence after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, and centering on Deng Xiaoping, who survived a party purge during Mao's reign and took over leadership of the country in 1978. These 8 figures oversaw the opening up of the Chinese economy to Western financial and business interests, including a June 1980 meeting of Rong Yiren, chairman of then newly established state investment firm CITIC, and David Rockefeller in Chase Manhattan's Wall Street headquarters. The meeting, attended by the chief executives of nearly 300 corporations, charted a course for economic and technical cooperation between the economies of China and the US. In the following years, scores of Fortune 500 companies established headquarters in Beijing's new Central Business District, and foreign direct investment in China increased from almost nothing at the time of the transition in the late 1970s to $128 billion last year, making the country now the top destination for foreign direct investment in the world. As a result, the descendants of the Eight Immortals now enjoy immense personal wealth and largely maintain the role of stewards of the Chinese economy. A 2012 Bloomberg special investigation examined 103 descendants and spouses of these immortals, finding that the families have diversified from control of state-run conglomerates into real estate development, private equity, and technology. 26 of those descendants, known as the Princelings, ran important state-owned companies or held top positions in them, with 3 of the most important heading or running companies with access to $1.6 trillion in capital. The almost unimaginable wealth of these elite families stands in stark contrast to the lives of the itinerant factory sweatshop workers in their company dormitories, and even sharper contrast to the party's officially espoused ideals about equality in the People's Democratic Republic of China. The contrast between this ruling class and the average Chinese worker is not lost on the Chinese themselves. Although the 8 immortals, there is growing resentment of the extremely wealthy princelings and their command over the lion's share of the economy. There is also a growing nationalist sentiment that are eager to see the country assert itself on the international stage, in defiance of the American paymasters who made the transition possible. Professor Michel Chossudovsky notes this tension within the Chinese leadership's own ranks.
China is, in some regards, an industrial colony. I use that quote unquote, but at the same time, it is an upcoming power on the global stage. And I should mention that emerged also in the wake of the Cold War, where China's alignments particularly vis-a-vis the Russian Federation, had changed dramatically to what they were in the during the Cold War era, and in the late 90s, particularly in the wake of the death of Deng Xiaoping and the demise of and the change of government in the Russian Federation. In other words, when Vladimir Putin became president, there we have a consolidation of an alliance between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and so on and so forth. And another very important dimension in the late 90s, ironically, just after Deng Xiaoping passed, there's an increased confrontation in the Taiwan Straits. Of course, there was always confrontation in the Taiwan Straits, but then it was at that point that China developed its military cooperation agreements with Russia, and started to build up a naval facilities in the South China Sea to counteract U.S. threats, and then, of course, we had a very major shift in geopolitical relations. I would say as of the late 90s, early 2000, early 21st century, which is increasingly towards confrontation between China and the United States. But I should qualify that, because when you go to China, you have a very pro-American intelligentsia, the peoples in the universities and so on. The School of Journalism of Tsinghua University is supported by Bloomberg. People at the Academy of Social Sciences are very much tied into Western values and so on and so forth. So that, in fact, I would say the leadership is very much divided. America is very visible. Western capital is very visible throughout China, but at the same time, it's more at the geopolitical level that there's confrontation. And I think that the Chinese say, well, we're a capitalist economy in our own right. We're not going to be a subordinate colony of the West. But if you look at the actual mechanics of foreign trade, they still are, because they're producing commodities for the world market, and they are sort of feeding the non-productive structures of Western capitalism.
The growing tensions in the South China Sea and the Asia-Pacific generally are real, they are palpable, and they are impossible to miss. The world is being prepped for a confrontation of some sort between the world's superpower and its growing rival in the East. But this confrontation, like every major world conflict before it, is largely bankrolled and even encouraged by the financiers and businessmen on both sides who cooperate with each other. For the time being, China continues its role as America's neocolonial outpost, a manufacturer of the cheap products that the US increasingly relies on, and a willing recipient of the US Federal Reserve notes and treasuries that represent the paper promises of the current world economic order. The only question is how long this relationship will last, and what it will look like when it ends. For more on this story, and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.
Russia and Iran sign a new military agreement allowing Russian jets to use an Iranian airbase for anti-ISIL missions in Syria.
In an unprecedented move, Russia has begun using an airbase in Iran to conduct bombing missions over Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry says its long-range bombers have carried out airstrikes against Daesh from the west of Iran at the Hamadan airbase. It's thought to be the first time Russian military aircraft have been deployed from Iranian soil in half a century.
Russia's defense ministry said that Moscow has deployed Russian bombers to an Iranian airbase to widen its campaign in Syria. But these bombers have already targeted militant targets. Those are Tupolev 22 M3 long-range bombers and Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, and they were launched from a Hamadan airbase in Iran. Well, according to reports, it's cheaper and quicker to fly them from Hamadan. This could reduce flying time by 60% and also could allow to increase the load on the plane. Before this, Russia was flying these bombers from its base in North Ossetia because its base in Latakia in Syria is not big enough for them. But flying time, the distance to Palmyra from North Ossetia is around 2,000 kilometers, whereas this distance to Palmyra from Hamadan is around 900 kilometers. But certainly, Russia and Iran share similar goals in Syria, and they are allies in the region. And both Russia and Iran are part of the same coalition fighting Daesh in Syria.
International news now, where it seems there's increasing cooperation over Syria. It follows Iran allowing Russia to use an airbase, and now China saying it will offer military help to the Syrian government.
Learning that China is seeking closer military ties with Syria, a senior Chinese military official just visited Damascus where he met. According to the agency, the Chinese and Syrian officials also talked about the possibility for China to provide military training and humanitarian aid to Syria. This talk about the possibility of China providing military training to Syrian government forces marks a change in China's more detached approach to the war in Syria. China had previously praised Russia's role there, but it may now provide more specific support to the fight against terrorists. The Chinese news agency also reported that while in Damascus, the Chinese military official also met with the Russian general. So you have a potential alliance forming not only with China, but also with Iran.
China and Russia are permanent members of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran wants to become a member. There's about 17 countries in all that either are permanent members, partners, which also include Turkey, Iran, India, Pakistan, and all the countries in Central Asia. It is a large organization. What's intriguing is that Russia is pivoting more toward the east.